afternoon. I'm Samantha Bretz, Allegheny Senior Economics major, a fellow for the Center for Business and Economics, and a member of the Law and Policy program. On behalf of those programs, I'd like to welcome you to the 17th Annual Executive Roundtable, the Opioid Crisis, Business, and the Economy. Today we welcome students, members of the college community, and visitors from off campus to participate in a civil conversation that explores the intersection of economics, policy, and global health in action. I would like to introduce our distinguished group of panelists. Today we will hear from Denise Alaprantis, Senior Research Economist at the Federal Reserve of Cleveland, Denise Johnson, Chief Medical Officer at the Meadville Medical Center, Republican Congressman Mike Kelly of Pennsylvania's 3rd District, and Elizabeth Smith, President and CEO of Accutech Precision Aerospace. We are honored to have them here on campus to talk about this important topic. Dr. Zachary Callan, Professor of Political Science, will serve as panel moderator. There are many individuals who have put forth their time, effort, and resources to make today's event possible. We would like to take a moment to thank each of the panelists for taking the time out of their busy schedules to engage in meaningful dialogue. We would also like to extend a warm thank you to Beth Ryan, our phenomenal program coordinator for the Center for Business and Economics, for her excellent work in preparing for this event. Sarah Holt, our building coordinator for Quigley Hall, and Craig Pardee for taking care of all things tech-related. Finally, the Executive Roundtable is made possible by funding from the Earl W. Adams Jr. Endowment, established by Bill Brown in honor of Earl Adams, a beloved teacher, mentor, and friend. It is through the support of dedicated alumni and friends of the college that students can participate in great programming like this roundtable. As I wrap up these opening remarks, I'd like to express my excitement as a student engaged in today's local and global issues to hear what perspectives our panelists will share on the opioid crisis as it relates to business and the economy. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce President Jim Mullen.
Samantha. I'm very pleased to join in welcoming everyone here today to Allegheny College and to the 17th Executive Roundtable presented by the Center for Business and Economics. First of all, I'd like to join in acknowledging and thanking our distinguished panelists, Congressman Kelly, Dr. Alaprantis, our good friend Denise Johnson from the Medical Center, and a very special part of the Allegheny family, although she's not a graduate, our friend Elizabeth Smith. It's indeed an honor for us to join in hosting you today, and we appreciate that you were going to share your insights and expertise with our campus and local community, and most importantly, our students. Thank you each for your leadership and your participation in today's discussion, and a special word of thanks to my colleague, Professor Callan, for moderating the discussion, and to every member of the faculty here today and on our campus, particularly in economics and law and policy, for their work to make events like this possible. I'd also like to acknowledge several special guests who are with us today, individuals who give graciously of their time and talents to support Allegheny. First, I offer my thanks to the members of the Center for Business and Economics Board of Visitors. These alumni and friends provide invaluable guidance to the economics department and serve as mentors for our students. If you could join me in thanking each of them here today. I'd also like to recognize two members of the Board of Trustees who are with us today, Jen DeRora and Rob Smith. Thank you both for your leadership. And in particular, I'd like to thank Trustee Bill Brown for his generous financial support of the Executive Roundtable through the endowed fund he established in honor of his mentor, Professor Emeritus Earl Adams. And please join us in a word of thanks to Earl Adams for the difference that he has made for so many students through the years. I also want to thank our friends at Armstrong. I see the red light is on, so I presume that we are recording this program for broadcast in our community. And as I thank them, I will also ask that all of us silence our cell phones and refrain from any recording of today's event. The Executive Roundtable brings together leading practitioners in business and related fields to discuss issues of regional, national, and global interest. This year's topic, the opioid crisis, has had tragic effects on individuals and families, communities, and as we will learn more about all of that today. It has also had far-reaching effects on business and the economy. I believe that colleges and universities must play a key role in helping society to address this crisis, not only in developing creative and compassionate solutions, but also in educating our students to become the problem solvers who will continue to address it as they take on leadership roles as professionals and as citizens. The promise and potential of these students gives me great hope for our shared future. Opportunities like the Executive Roundtable reflect the core values of our institution. First, there are opportunities for us to engage in frank and civil discussion of vital issues. Such discussions rooted in academic rigor are a hallmark of Allegheny College and are consistent with our special place in the history of American higher education for more than 2 centuries. A shared commitment to civility and to the exchange of different viewpoints is at the core of our mission as a residential liberal arts college, and we believe should be at the core of what it means to be a citizen in our nation. We are a community of learning that is deeply rooted in the liberal arts tradition. That tradition grows from a commitment to the rigorous pursuit of truth, to the free and full discussion of ideas, and to a respect for difference. So with no further ado, it is with great pleasure that I again welcome our panel, and we look forward to the discussion that will ensue. Thank you all very much.
All right, so first, thank you to everyone for being here. And we have a really great panel today, so I think we're going to have a really good conversation. I'm excited about it. I just want to remind the panelists before we get started that although it seems like we have a lot of time, time goes really fast. So I have a couple of questions for everyone. The idea is that there's sort of a short answer and a long answer question. So I don't have to yell at anybody. So there's police yourself, right? And I will, so just that out of the way. I just want to say a couple of things very briefly to set the stage a little bit. So in 2016, 116 people died every day from opioid overdoses. And 11.5 million people misused opioids in some way. The overall economic cost of opioid addiction is about $504 billion with a B in 2016. So this is sort of an incredibly large-scale economic, political, and health crisis. And it has a particular impact on rural areas in the United States. Rural areas that are already struggling with problems like deindustrialization, depopulation, and numerous other policy concerns. And so this is a really timely conversation. I hope that today we can start to put together some interesting ideas about the scope of the problem and even potential solutions. And I'd like to actually start with Ms. Smith. And I think this is the biggest question that's on the table for today's event. And that is, how has the opioid crisis impacted your business?
Thanks, Zach. Thanks for having me. As you saw in the program, I'm the president and CEO of a 450-person company headquartered in Meadville, Pennsylvania. And as an aerospace company, we do very high precision components, dynamic components for all manner of rotorcraft and fixed-wing aircraft. So really really technically challenging things that our employees are using million-dollar pieces of equipment to make. So for us, it's very important that we have a sober workforce. For the first challenge that we have is hiring, actually. We have added over 100 positions in the past 5 years. We'll be adding 100 more over the next 5 years. And we find that people don't fail drug tests. Instead, they opt out of the hiring process altogether. So we have fewer applicants for these positions than we would otherwise. And we can't count that. So we don't know exactly what the impact of that is. Once they're in the door, however, the biggest loss for us is performance and turnover issues. We do have a really talented workforce, and opioids tend to hit those in their prime earning potential, people 20 to 50 years old. We've had people impacted everywhere in the company, from management to secondary operations, and we see more of the symptoms of drug issues rather than actual signs of impairment. So those signs of issues, addiction issues, are absenteeism, quality issues, performance, lack of performance, and those really have a significant cost. We had one person that we found subsequently had a drug issue. A lot of times we don't find out until after they're already gone. And that cost us over $30,000 alone in one complete scrap order. So there's a significant financial impact from lack of quality, as well as an impact to insurance. 10 years ago, before I rejoined the company actually, there was a very large case. We were self-insured at that point for health insurance. And we had an employee who was let go for quality and attendance. He elected COBRA coverage, and within the next 18 months, we had paid for 2 livers. So it was a cost of 7-figure impact to us. As a smaller company at that point, that was a severe financial impact to us as an organization. And finally, I will say, this comes back to a later question, we do work with our employees to retain them as much as possible. They are our #1 investment, and we seek to get a return on that investment and retain them as long as we possibly can. So we work with them. We do not have a zero tolerance policy, and there are many ways to work with employees to keep them employed, which we try to do.
Thanks. So I want to sort of stay on this sort of question of the scope of the problem, but maybe reorient a little bit to sort of why. So Dr. Alaprantis, could you tell us a bit about why the opioid crisis has come to a region like Northwest PA? Like what are the driving forces at work here?
So thanks for that question. So I'll start by saying I'm an economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, so what I'm going to say are my opinions, and they don't reflect necessarily the opinions of the Federal Reserve. And then I'll also say that, just to be a little humble and say that I'm a research economist, so I have a lot of training in terms of statistical techniques to try to answer some questions like this, but in terms of a lot of the practical questions, probably defer to other people on the panel. But in terms of, why has a crisis come to, say, Northwest Pennsylvania? Something that's actually a little bit surprising about this is how widespread the problem is. So that question is really more about why has it come to the U.S. And over time, there have really been 3 major waves where the crisis has expanded. So the first is kind of a long-term increase, if you measure it in terms of deaths, overdose deaths. The first issue is kind of this long-term increase in prescription deaths, so overdoses from prescription opioids. And that's been a long-term trend since the early 90s. And then more recently, things have happened really since 2010 that have kind of really picked up speed. So since 2010, heroin overdose deaths have increased dramatically, and since 2013, synthetic opioids like fentanyl or carfentanil, those have picked up very quickly. And the issues about, kind of why those things have happened, the long-term prescription deaths has to do with kind of how we manage pain in this country, and how that differs from other places. And the more recent things are more about kind of the illicit drug market, and also its relationship with the legal market.
Great. So I want to switch, I guess, to more to a political question now, sort of Mr. Kelly. And so I was sort of curious if you could tell us a bit about what kinds of political policies have exacerbated this crisis? So like, how have we sort of perhaps failed to address this, right, with federal or even local laws?
Well, I think sometimes there's a misconception that if you throw more money at a problem, you'll actually come up with an answer. When we talk about pain control, I think that's what we're driving at. So a lot of the reimbursement is based on pain control, or how the patient would rate the way he or she felt after a certain operation. So it comes down to, well, if we can control the pain, then we're really accomplishing what we need to accomplish. And unfortunately, too many of the opioids that we develop are addictive. Now, that creates problems all across the board. All across the board. And all of you, I bet there's not a person in this room that would say that I don't have an idea or never run into anybody that has a problem like this. Because whether we realize it or not, we are all either dependents or codependents. We either have somebody very close to us in our family, in our scope of friends, that has this problem. And when we have that problem, it is a problem for all of us. So what do political issues have to do with it? Well, we do have the ability to tax people and collect great revenues. Then we also have the responsibility of how do we distribute that money? How do we dole that money out, and where do we send the money? What do we earmark it for? So I would think that it's sometimes, I think we've gotten too far away from things that actually work into the greater the amount of dollars we dedicate, the better effects we're going to have. I think that's totally wrong-sided and wrong-headed. There are ways to address pain without having addictive drugs. So I think that's the scope of what we have to do. But unfortunately, in politics, the answer is, what can I do today? What can I say today? What policy can I initiate today? Or collectively, what can we do that softens a problem that we have? I would think that right now, today, the number one problem, I think, whether it's, I think the same thing with mental health or addiction, too often there is a personal stigma that goes with it, and we turn a blind eye or a deaf ear to it because it's a failure. It's a failure on the part of society. And then when we talk about society, how far down does that go? And usually it goes all the way to the roots of the community or the family that you live with. People are saying, well, that's just not something that happens in my town. That's not something that happens in my family. That's just not something that I'm willing to admit is blanketing the whole country right now. And not just in America, by the way, but globally. So when it comes to political answers to that, it really does come to how can we distribute money that has the general overall good in mind, as opposed to just coming up with an answer that maybe solves a problem to get through an election. Say, no, we're aware of it, we're taking care of it, and this is how much money we've dedicated to it. You know, in the last Omni, we've now dedicated $4 billion to the opioid situation. Now the question is, how is that money being spent? And is there a good return on that investment, not just for the taxpayers, but for each and one of us as American citizens? How is that affecting the people that we live with?
So I think that's actually a great set of comments that transitions to my sort of first question for Dr. Johnson, which is, right, from a medical perspective, what are the best tools for men and women struggling with addiction? Like, what are sort of the best treatment options?
Well, I think, first of all, people have to seek treatment. So that, you know, I think one of the things that we heard here is talking about the stigma. And one of the things that is prevalent in society is, you know, like Mr. Kelly said, that, you know, people think it's not my problem, or it's a failure if you have that problem, and so people feel stigmatized to come forward. They're concerned about their jobs, they're concerned about other perceptions, and so they may not come forward. This takes a multimodal approach to treatment, and so that the medication-assisted treatment is really important. It's important for helping with the cravings, helping people to get into the right frame of mind for the long-term treatment. This is not something that's going to be, you know, take this other pill and that's going to be cured. It's a long-term treatment. People first have to identify that they have a problem, seek treatment, and then get this medication-assisted treatment. They also need to have behavioral treatment as well. So it's not enough to just medicate to treat the symptoms or the cravings, but they really need to understand how to control this addiction, tools to be able to work and produce and go on in their lives. So they really have to have this behavioral therapy or counseling. There also needs to be help in terms of what that support system is. This is a problem that affects not only the individual, but the families, the community, the workplace, and this person we're planning to function in life afterwards and be productive. And so they really need a strong support system of family, of community, of faith-based groups, all those supports to make sure that that person is going to be able to stay on track in their recovery journey. So it's not as simple as, just one approach or another. You really need all of that to be in place to make someone successful. And it's a long journey. People are not often successful at the first try or in a short period of time. This is really an ongoing journey.
So I think we've sort of made, we're making this sort of transition in discussions of sort of treatments. So now for this next set of questions, you have more time. So you can sort of, take some of these ideas and expand on them, and we're doing great. So I actually want to go back to Ms. Smith again, Sort of based on what sort of Dr. Johnson and Mr. Kelly have sort of said, what are the kind of tools that you need as a business leader, or that your employees need to really help them overcome opioid addiction? And I think you can speak generally, but specifics are also always great.
Thanks, Zach. So the number one thing that we look for as an employer is really when we identify a person with an addiction issue, or they self-identify, or we identify and then they admit to it. We really want to get them into a rehab facility very quickly. There's a small window of time in which they're willing, or oftentimes until they're addicted, until that next hit, which could kill them. So we really need to make sure that these recovery programs are available and accessible. And we have not found a facility that is within our state that usually has openings, let alone our county. We've had most luck with Glen Bay in Northeast Ohio. They particularly are outstanding at following up. So they will check in with our HR department when we have somebody there to discuss how things are progressing. And then after they return to the workplace, they check in and say, hey, how are things going? Here's the things that we look for in terms of measuring progress. Are you seeing that happening, or are you seeing these other signs that could indicate that we might have another issue? So they really help our HR department navigate that ongoing recovery. So one is that resource availability. Second is internal to the company, really helping us identify those people and having them willing to self-identify. And that's building a culture of trust within the organization. I said before, not having a zero tolerance policy, demonstrating that you have retained people through rehab, through a second rehab. We have an employee right now who has been through a rehab facility in Florida and in Ohio, and he's still an employee. And people see that, and he is a good peer resource to people who are struggling with issues. He's somebody that people can go to before they go to HR, just to say, hey, I don't want to get fired. How do I go about this so that I don't get fired? So with that trust, it's also important, to have peer-to-peer accountability, not as ratting somebody out, but seeing, hey, I don't want to enable my friend over here to continue being an addict. I really want to help him address that. So to enable that culture of support and trust, it's important to support the employee after rehabilitation. And the employer can do several things to maximize the chances for success. Our HR director calls it changing their zip code. They may often need to find a new network of friends. They may need to find a new living situation to set them up for success and get them out of old habits. We have the unique aspect of having 2 facilities in Pennsylvania, so we'll often send them to the other facility. We can work between shifts, change their shift maybe. We can change their department. They may need a less stressful position when they return back to work. So we offer them alternative positions that may be easier for them to handle mentally, so that they can focus on the things they need to focus out in their life. Then, as a condition of coming back, they also need to agree to randomized drug screening. That helps them hold themselves accountable, and it makes sure that we don't have an issue going forward. So that's often a contingency of returning. And then finally, supporting them in ongoing behavioral counseling that may happen during working hours, making sure that they can get to appointments, working with them on their schedule to make sure they can leave early some days, to go to meetings and other resources that they need in order to continue their journey. Thirdly, to help educate management and people in the company on signs of addiction. So even beyond impairment signs of different drugs and alcohol, as well as signs of absenteeism, quality issues. Talk to them about what might be causing those. Is it as simple as they have car trouble, so they're having trouble getting in, or is there something deeper there that we need to address? And finally, working with our health insurers. They're a fantastic resource, along with the Meadville Medical Center, to make sure that they aren't using opioids as a first course of addressing any type of pain management, that they use physical therapy, that they use behavioral therapy. A lot of times, addiction is simply self-medicating a mental issue. So do they have access to mental health services? Really trying to have those conversations with people, and you can only have those conversations if you have a trusting environment. So I think as an employer, you're spending probably more time with this person than anybody other than family, and it's a responsibility to help each other out.
Do you have a sense that your business's practices, are they unique, or are they commonplace,
I think we have the ability to do this now that we're larger. We have more resources. It's really hard for a small employer to figure out how to set up an employee assistance program. I think that's where the Meadville Medical Center comes in, to be able to help out as an extension. We have a lot of very small employers in this community that don't have a lot of those resources, but I think it is common that everybody here looks out for each other. I think everybody is connected to everybody else in multiple ways, and I think that's something that we can really harness in a positive way in this area. So even where smaller companies may not have the resources, they have access to people to help them out.
So, Dr. Johnson, I have sort of a similar question for you, and sort of that is, what sort of materials or expertise does Meadville Medical Center need to help you best address the problem of opioid addiction?
Well, there's, again, it's a multifactorial approach, and as Ms. Smith talked about, there are a lot of things that patients need as they're in this recovery. She talked about our employee assistance program, and so that we do work on helping companies to identify and as well as support the people who are dealing with addiction. We also offer treatment for patients. We have an inpatient detox unit, so these are for patients who need detox, but they also have some other medical issues, and so we're able to bring people in that way. But there is a need to work across the community, across all the different agencies to be able to really affect some change. Here in Meadville, we have the Crawford County Overdose Prevention Coalition, and it is a group that includes law enforcement, social services, drug and alcohol treatment, mental health treatment, all the different agencies within the community that can help to affect change. They've been doing a lot of work to identify areas that we can have some improvement in the community, but there's still a lot more needed. There is a need for treatment. Again, as you noted, we have a treatment center at Meadville, but often beds are full. It's hard to find treatment for patients that are nearby, and so sometimes patients have to go really quite far to get treatment. So there's definitely a need for expanded treatment programs nearby. As I said before, medication-assisted treatment is just part of it, but there also needs to be behavioral counseling. To get access to behavioral counseling for patients is quite difficult, to get the appropriate counseling for them to have, and then also to afford counseling, because some people are insured, some people are not insured, and to make sure that they're getting all of the treatment they need, that can be difficult to have access to the right type of counseling. And then, of course, the support system. There is need in the community to work on that support system and to provide that infrastructure that will set people up for success. But, that's a need in the community as well. In our rural communities, transportation is a major problem. It's a problem for people to get access to treatments that they need. It also can tend to make people isolated as well, and so that transportation limits us a lot in some of the treatments that we are needing to use. So definitely much more availability than of treatment centers, access to the appropriate behavioral counseling, transportation as well, and then, again, funding to afford that treatment.
So I think your discussion of transportation is really sort of interesting because it's maybe not something that we sort of think of right away as being sort of a causal factor that would matter in this way, right? So how do you imagine working around the transport? Like how do you solve this geographic problem? What are first steps in that?
So we right now at Meadville Medical Center, we do have a medical transportation system. So we have a whole department that is provides transportation to people for medical appointments. We have some of it is funded, some of it we have volunteer drivers who will volunteer then to take people on their medical appointments. So there is some funding, there's some volunteer services for transportation. We do have a bus system in Meadville, but again, the bus system is limited because we're so rural. It's really hard to get to individual houses. So we have some fragments of what is needed for a transportation system, but we really need to have comprehensive transportation available for anyone who might need that. So it may be that patients who need treatment would have access to this medical transportation regardless of insurance, or they would have some insurance that would cover it. So that certainly is a need then for people to be able to get treatment.
So I think continuing sort of in this direction, I want to sort of shift to perhaps a slightly wider perspective, right? So Dr. Alaprantis, right? So what is is there a way forward, right, out of the opioid crisis, right? So what are some of the, if we've talked about what happens at employers or with medical treatment, what are broader social or economic tools that could be used to move us out of this problem?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I'm going to actually tie that back into your earlier question to me. So I think a lot of that depends on what are the key drivers of what's going on here. So it's some really influential research, some Princeton economists, Ann Case and Angus Deaton. So Angus Deaton is a Nobel laureate that just won the Nobel Prize recently. They noticed that suicide rates in a lot of, essentially white prime-age males have been going up for a while. And they've interpreted this as an indication, and they also kind of interpret opioid deaths as well as kind of an extension of suicide. And they've kind of interpreted this as this notion of kind of deaths of despair. And they're really worried that in a lot of rural areas of the United States, there's this kind of economic malaise, and it's leading to loss of meaning and people having a tough time. So that's kind of one kind of view of what's driving things. And the obvious answer there is thinking about economics, thinking about how do we care for each other, how do we lift each other up. And so I think there's a set of things. For example, you look at regional malaise. One of my colleagues, Mark Schweitzer, has actually shown that when you look at relative income since 2000, the industrial heartland, what we think of as kind of this general region, incomes haven't risen with the rest of the country. And so you think there is something going on with the economics. And I'm very sympathetic to that. But I'll also push back on this issue of deaths of despair. So there's a lot of other things that could be explaining kind of the opioid crisis and some of these suicide rates we see. So a couple of things, for example, so they're comparing our suicide rates across white prime age workers to those in other industrialized countries like Europe, and some things are very different here than in Europe. So access to, say, mental health treatment, so universal health care, things like access to firearms, and then also just the rate at which we prescribe opioids. So I actually think I'm very sympathetic to this issue of deaths of despair, and I think it doesn't hurt to think in those terms and to try to lift up, people in regions that aren't doing as well economically. I think there's nothing lost in thinking about that. But I think the best evidence we have actually indicates that a lot of this is being driven actually by, this is an issue about the drug environment. So it looks like pain doesn't really vary that much across space, but prescription rates actually do. And there's evidence that a lot of that is driven by, physician training. So, and then there's other evidence saying that maybe it's not, this economic issue. So my own research, when we look at the effects of the Great Recession, actually opioid use didn't increase at all in response to the Great Recession, which was a major labor market shock. So it makes you think if there's this, even if it's a longer term issue, this death and despair story, the evidence in favor of it isn't as strong as you might suspect. So that makes me think, if you think about the drug environment, then you think of some very obvious and basic things are physician education and practice, access to treatment, and then just simple things like shutting down the pill mills. But yeah, so I think we're still working on the research in terms of what is the primary factor responsible for these things, but I would just say that I think it's important to realize that whatever we think we conclude from the research is ultimately driving this, is more responsible for driving this. I don't think it's mutually exclusive that we have to work on the drug environment or we have to work on the economics. I think you can do both at the same time, and I think we should.
So sort of in that vein, I think one thing that strikes me as you're sort of talking is that some of these solutions are really long-term, like physician training can be a really sort of long-term, slow shift to move potentially, right? So how do we balance long and short-term solutions on such an immediate sort of problem?
You're asking me?
Actually, can I answer?
Yes, please.
Well, I do agree that, over the years, as we've seen the statistics and the slope rise for opioid addiction and deaths, we know that prescribing has really taken off. And so that in this country, we do a lot of opioid prescribing, much more than in any other country in any other areas. Some of it has to do with physician training. I think that, physicians weren't really very trained in pain management. We came to believe that opioids could be a nice, good, quick fix. You have a patient in front of you who is suffering. Pain is so subjective. We're all empathetic. We want to help that person. We want to help them with the pain management. We weren't trained in terms of how to manage that opioid for a short term, how to wean someone off, and how to really focus on alternative treatments. There also is not good funding or reimbursement for alternative treatments, so that a person who really needs stress management and yoga is going to have to pay for that on their own, or they can get a prescription that their insurance will cover. And so that, those sort of easy ways to manage pain left us then with this long-term problem. Since then, and since recognizing that issue, there have been a lot of things that have been in place. Here in Pennsylvania, we've got the Physician Drug Monitoring Program, which we didn't have before, where we really can see where your patients are getting medications from and who else is treating them for that. When that was first proposed for physicians, we were worried, oh my goodness, what's that going to be like for our workflow? This is really intrusive, this is going to be really difficult. But we really found benefit in it, and we really opened our eyes to say, oh my goodness, I'm treating this person who has pain, they're getting all this medication, that's not really appropriate. So physician education, I think physician awareness is something that really has come to the forefront, and physicians are aware now. They're aware of the patients are getting other prescriptions for. And so that has changed your prescribing practices. For licensing for physicians in Pennsylvania now, there is additional education on opioid prescribing that's required when we license, and so we're working on that prescription there. So I think the awareness, the access to more information for physicians, and then more education that's happening is affecting the prescribing. But we still then have the issue of, we really know that physical therapy can be much better than narcotic pain medication for a lot of pain, but it's not well funded, and so that you know, you can be covered for your pain medication, your opioid, but you can't be covered for those therapies. So those are things that need to change, and educating patients that, you know, these alternatives really do have benefit, and then setting the right expectation. I think that, you know, we think that pain medication should leave you with the absence of any pain whatsoever, and that's not realistic in most cases. And so setting the right expectation on what those actual goals will be is something that we need to do a better job of.
All right, so for my last questions for Mr. Kelly, so there's no pressure. But could you tell us just a bit, the sort of sticking with the idea of sort of solutions? I was curious if you could tell us a bit about how you think sort of political institutions or perhaps nonprofit organizations sort of could actually work together to deal with this crisis. So trying to think more specifically about the kinds of institutional changes, the kinds of policy changes that we could see that would really sort of suggest forward motion.
Yeah, I think that, because everybody's talked, whether it's a doctor or Beth, and I don't know how many people out here have actually experienced this fact or had this occasion where somebody, I said earlier, a friend or a family, if a family member is not, I can just tell you, it's become too close for me. And I think, again, I'm going back to what role would government have in working with the private sector? I really believe that the most effective efforts that I see, and the change normally takes place during the times of a crisis or a tragedy. I think we're looking right now, we're beyond a crisis now. This is an epidemic, this is a full-blown epidemic. When you start losing 115 or 116 people a day, then there needs to be more awareness of it. So how would government work then? I really believe that each community has a unique ability to take care of its citizens. The communities know better, I think, than somebody going to Washington and saying, you know, we've thought about this, and we think this will work in Meadville, Pennsylvania. We think this will work in Erie, Pennsylvania. We think this will work in Sharon or down in Butler. I've always believed that the best solutions come right from the people who are undergoing the experience. At this point in my life, I used to coach children's sports. I can't tell you the number of funerals I've been to in funeral homes where I've actually gone in and I've had a young person that I had coached, and there's always the pictures of them in their little league outfit or their little football outfit, and then you look at this person laying in a coffin and you say, what happened from the time that child was there playing every day to where he or she is today? And I think the awareness part of it is the one that comes in. I said earlier, we're all either dependents or codependents. I think when we start to realize that this is a community problem, and this is not something set aside, I will tell you, I'll be very honest with you, because I live with it every day. The people who are addicts are referred to too often as the worst of society. We talk about them as dopers, we talk about them as the worst of the worst, and we do these things. Now, they usually self-medicate. They feel terrible about the fact that they're an addict. The only way they can get over that is to take something to make them get through that time period. Then they start to feel sorry, or they feel bad, but I had to take something to get over feeling bad. It's a vicious circle. The other issue, and I don't know how many people realize this, listen, there's two addictions. There's your physical addiction, which you can go to a clinic, you can go to a detox, you can go to a month-long program and come out of there and feel, you know what, I was able to get through that entire program. But while you were in the clinic, the disease was waiting for you in the parking lot. Because there is a mental addiction that takes place, far greater, by the way, than the physical addiction. And I think when we start to confuse the fact that these people want to be this way, as opposed to they need our help, then we can't make that transition. And we always look to, well, there needs to be somebody needs to do something about this. And I have people tell me, look, Mom, they say, so what are you going to do about this? And I turn around and I said, what do you think we should do, and what would your role be? And say, well, no, not me. What are you going to do about it? I said, it's your town. It's your son. It's your daughter. Tell me where you are. Oh, no, I've walked away from it because you know what? It's exhausting. And for those folks out there, by the way, that have this problem at home, there is nothing more exhausting than to have somebody who is ill in your family because you want them to get better. You want to do anything you can to get better. The trouble with the addiction is you can put your life savings into sending them to clinics. You can send them to detox after detox after detox, and they come back out, and within hours in some cases, they're back on the street buying something to get them through something that's addictive in their mind. I've always thought that the best answer to most things in my life, it has been the faith-based people. The people who really look at our fellow citizens as brothers and sisters and not problems is the way we're able to fix things. I've got to tell you, because I'm also in business. And for those people out there that don't understand this, do you know the liability that goes with you have somebody in your staff or on your payroll that is an addict? You are liable for anything that they do that's wrong. And then the question comes up, well, if you knew they were an addict, if you knew they were an alcoholic, and you hired them, and they went out and they had something while they were working for you on the payroll, they had an accident, that's really your fault. That's not their fault. I want you to put yourself in these people's places. They can go to interview after interview after interview and not get hired. And we tell them, you know what, you're just going to have to get tougher. You're going to have to find a way to cut through all that. And there's nothing easier than being in the stands as opposed to being on the field and actually facing it every day. Because I can tell people all kind of advice as long as I'm not the person in the battle. But I think the number one problem we have, and this is after going through this, in my case, from the time somebody was 14 years old to the time that they're 38 now, and the exhaustion that comes with it, not just with the parent or the relative, but also with the person themselves. It is that loss of hope that you can never recover. And I don't know how many of you have ever been in that situation. When you are on the darkest of your days and you think, I can never get out of this, no matter what I do, I can't get better. Then the question becomes, what role is societies, and then what role is government? The only thing I think government can do, government can get a deeper look at what's going on and what government can do to help people get out of that problem. We can't prevent it, because a lot of these are choices that are made, sometimes very carelessly, depending on your genetic makeup. Some people it doesn't affect. Some people it gets right away. That's the real challenge. So how do we get away from this? But Doctor, you talk very clearly about this. Listen, you can go through every detox in the world, but if you don't have the support, once you get out of that detox, if you're not able to go to one meeting a day, minimum one meeting a day, sometimes 2 meetings a day, where you sit down with a peer group that's been what you've gone through, that understands the pain and the depth of despair that you're going through, that can tell you, I too am in that same position. Let me tell you what I do to get through it. And you help that person. I'm really worried about this. We think that the answer to this is throwing more money at it, and it's not the answer. Money is not the answer, but effective treatment is. And then the other part is all of us as human beings. There's something that burns within us. There's something that is a decision maker where we either say, I'm going to beat this, or I give up. I give up. I wish it were always the former and not the latter. But having watched this happen in my life, and I can tell you, I've watched it so many times, and I've watched these folks, and it is so sad to see the loss of human potential because of this addiction. I would go back, I got to tell you, this idea that we can treat pain, or the idea is to get rid of pain. I grew up in a time period when the way you get rid of pain was to take a couple aspirin. And people would tell you, look, it's going to hurt, it's going to be really bad for you, but if you do this, eventually you'll get through it. Today, we do have products that will eliminate pain so quickly, and I think a lot of the people, not only their physical pain, but their emotional pain of being in the position that we're in is very difficult. Physical pain is much easier to deal with than emotional pain, and all of you know that. Anybody that suffered a loss, a personal loss, you know how difficult it is to get through those days. Usually it's by somebody else showing up that holds your hand or prays with you or tells you, I think we can get through this, I've been through it too. But I see this has developed in an altogether different direction. I wish I could come here today and say, we have the answer. Because if it's going to be we, it's going to be a collective we, and it's going to be something different for each one of those personalities. I think too many times people think, well, government should be able to solve this. Government cannot solve anything of its own. People will solve it. And people who have open hearts, open minds, and are willing to put themselves out there. I will just tell you, the people that are in this business, and you know this to be true, they need help too. They feel the pain. They get tired. And they're the ones that are on that front line all day long, and too often there's nobody there to help support them. That's right. I love the outside groups that can come in, and you can go to a meeting in the morning, you can go to a meeting in the evening or at lunchtime, and different people get a chance to help you out. But if you're on duty, as you have seen this, you do this all day long, there is a stress factor that just overwhelms people, and they get to the point where they give up hope. I'm talking about people that help people who need help, and I think that's the danger that we face as a society. But seriously, how can we look at losing 116 lives a day and think this is not about me? Because it isn't about me, it's about us. And I think that having forums like this, and all of you out there, can play a role at some degree. You can't do it every minute of every day, but maybe you can help out in a way that you never thought you could help before. Maybe there's something you can do. And a lot of it is just putting your hand on that shoulder, saying, Beth, I know you're going through a really tough time. I need somebody to talk to. Give me a call. You want to have a cup of coffee? Let me know. Let me try to help you get through that crisis. So these are crisis times for us, and I agree with Dr. I think that, look how many people showed up. And this is across the spectrum. I see people who are my age, and I see really young people, and I see one thing that's really here. You are all here because you care very deeply about what's going on in your family, in your community, in your churches, in your schools, what's happening in our country. So the answer is right out here. Each one of you. Each one of you is the answer. I don't think any of us by ourselves have the answer.
All right, so thank you. I want to thank first all my panelists for their great sort of comments today and for being here today. I think they've given us a lot to sort of think about and talk about. And so I think now we're going to open things up for Q&A from the audience. We have a lot to talk about, so I think we're going to keep our questions as focused as we can on the issue of the day. But other than that, I think there's students with microphones out there, right, wandering around. So yeah, so if you have a question, throw your hand up, and they'll find you. And yeah.
Thank you all for your time. Thank you all for sharing your understanding of the problem. Thank you, Mr. Kelly, for, it seems like you're very well versed in the issue. I wonder what role we see the private sector, like Ms. Smith, successfully moving from punitive action for these people suffering from a disease. How do you see the role of government in moving away from punitive measures and more so addressing the fact that addiction is an illness?
Well, again, only because I'm so close to it, and the number of people that I've actually visited in prisons, and they're in there because they're addicts. Their crime is that they're an addict, and it causes he or she to do things that society will not accept and cannot accept. I would rather get them earlier and say, I'm more willing to spend time on treatment than I am on jail time. Now, I will tell you this though, sometimes it's that time in jail that keeps them clean for enough time that they're actually still alive. Too often, we're not able to intercede early. I think the other thing is, we have the ability right now, Narcan, you can actually overdose and somebody can come and give you a shot and bring you back to life. The bad part about that is the fact that they've saved your life, but now it becomes embedded in your brain. I can overdose and I can take a shot and I'll be all right. That's okay. if there's actually somebody there that can give you the shot, but too often there's not. So I think that in society we tend to look that the best thing to do is get these folks that don't fit into society and separate them. We'll put them in some type of an incarceration. I know a lot of in the drug courts, I've sat in and listened to how people are trying to deal with this. They have a little different idea about what the solution would be. And while it's not incarceration, maybe it is telling somebody, hey, you know what, we'll get you to a detox, we'll get you out of that thing. Then you're going to be in a halfway house, and you're going to be heavily monitored. Some people on their own can do it, but for most of us, you can't do it on your own. So it's better when you have somebody that checks you in all day long, and it's better when you're actually separated. Now, the one thing I do know from these addictions, the worst thing for you is to go back to where it is you started this. Being around friends and locations helps promote that continued use of a product. So it's better to transplant somebody from where they're known and where they have a line of credit to a place where that's not happening and not everybody knows who they are. Oftentimes, listen, these folks that are in this business, and believe me, if you're a user, at one time or another you're probably sold, and they usually sell in order to get money so they can continue to use. But they know where these centers are. And these folks kind of hang around those areas because they know somebody's going to be coming out of that meeting that's going to be able to go and say, you know what, man, I'll tell you what, I'm just at the point today, I'm trying, but I think maybe just a little bit, okay, maybe just tonight. So the incarceration part, I get that part of it, saved a lot of lives, but I think what it does, it staves off. I think being able to move somebody from one room to another is actually better for them and get them into something. Listen, we know this. It's free time that hurts all. If you have too much time to sit around and think about things, that's the worst thing for you. It's better to be active all day long. And at the end of that period, you're so dog tired that you just want to get some sleep. You're not looking for a conditional high.
So I just wanted to follow up on that real quick. So it's a little bit hard to speak after that because it's very clear you feel a lot of empathy for this, and you know a lot about this, and you've been struggling with this. I just wanted to push a little bit on the front of getting them earlier, because you're talking about earlier in the treatment, and I think there's a group of people, and there's evidence in the literature about a lot of people have been prescribed opioids and then become addicted to those, not realizing kind of the trade-offs of this will stop my pain right now, but it's possibly addictive later on. And there's evidence that a lot of people that end up showing up for, like, say, for example, heroin treatment later on, were introduced to painkillers, which are not so different from heroin, through legal prescriptions. And I think there's a big class of people like that. And so I would just push that we should also try to get people a little bit earlier along that dimension, in the sense that I don't know if government's the best way to do it, if it's physician education, private initiative, exactly what the best combination of those things are. But I do think that at the very least, people knowing what the risks are when they take the prescriptions.
Do you know what, Doug? I agree with you. I think that one of the things that we face in government is always people will say, well, do you know what the cost of this program is? Do you know what this is costing our taxpayers? And my answer to them is, well, do you know what the cost of not doing it is? Because the cost of treating this is a lot less than the cost of not treating it, and letting it grow to the proportion that it is today, whether it's our productivity, because whoever's not productive at work today, somebody else has to pick up the slack, and maybe she has to do twice as much as she would have done because the other person wasn't able to do any. So I think that sometimes we become penny wise and pound foolish, that we put a price tag on everything and say, I'm not sure that I want to waste taxpayer money on that. And then my answer to that is, well, I'm not sure that I want to waste taxpayer money going into the future, not addressing it, or thinking that somehow the answer is you get them off the rolls, is if they'll die. And too often I've heard people tell me, we don't worry about these folks anymore. I said, why is that? Or did they get curious? No, they passed. I said, oh my God, are you serious? I mean, that's how we, in some cases, think, because it is so overwhelming. But the cost of not doing it is the one I think, that's the one we need to know, and that's how it affects lives, how it affects communities, churches, schools, and going forward. How does it affect the next generation? I mean, where's Beth going to find those highly skilled workers?
Well, thanks. My name is Mike Porter. I'm a class of 1980 here in Allegheny, and glad to be back here to talk to you folks. I also have 3 nephews right now who are heroin addicts. One's in rehab in California right now for the nursing home here in Crawford County with heart issues that I'm not sure he's been surviving the C30. My question on this is, we spent a lot of time here, and I have 900 questions, frankly. But the big one I have is on this, their gateway drugs, all their cases were not prescriptions. And I'm just curious as to Dr. Johnson in particular, is what what you see percentage-wise with that. I know Ms. Smith, you talked about your employees. Do you see people coming into your employment that are already struggling with these drugs and these things, or is it something that we do need to spend more and more time on that prevention and trying to keep them off of the first place? That's my question.
For me? So the question is, what sort of drugs do we see people coming in on?
Yes.
So I think already mentioned before, it really does seem like the epidemic really increases. We really increased a lot of our prescribing. We are seeing people that are addicted to heroin, but a large percentage of those patients or those people started out with a prescription. So you start out with a prescription and you take it for a legitimate reason, but your body is used to it, and when you're not taking it, you feel bad, and so you need to take more. The prescription drugs are expensive, and so that if you want to buy the pills to treat your habit, it's cost prohibitive for someone to stay on prescription medications unless you're really very wealthy, and so that heroin is cheap and easy, and so that a lot of people then, when they really can't afford to continue their prescription drug habit, may switch to the heroin. We don't necessarily distinguish, for the most part, what people overdose on, because a lot of times they overdose on a combination of medications, so that there might be heroin, there might be some fentanyl, there might be other opioids in there, and so that most of the overdoses that we see and the deaths have multiple substances. So we don't have a very good way right now of distinguishing, although we're starting to do that a little bit more, but what we're seeing people coming in with overdoses on, the overdose killer really has been the fentanyl. The fentanyl, which is 100 times more potent than morphine, and the carfentanil that you've heard of, that is hundreds of times more potent than that. Those are coming in then lacing other drugs, illegal drugs that people would buy, and so those have high potency and really do cause more overdose and death. So no real good numbers for that, but I think that the prescription drug is probably the majority of at least getting people to that point, if not the cause. But then heroin has been increasing as well, but it's often a combination, not, for the most part, it's not just one drug.
I'll jump in and say it's also not a prescription, their prescription. It could be a family member's prescription, and there were leftover drugs somewhere in the house, and they wanted a crazy weekend and augment the usual drinking with something else, and then go from there. We've had a case where somebody's mother had advanced cancer, had a lot of prescription medications in the household, and that's how they became addicted. Another issue I think that we haven't brought up yet, but I think Dr. Johnson alluded to it, is the ongoing management. So once they're in recovery, they'll often be prescribed methadone or Suboxone, ongoing to a sort of a legal option to prevent withdrawals, and it's sort of a stepping stone, but it's often used with no end in sight. So they'll just be prescribed this, they go and get their legal hit, and oftentimes it's used like that. In fact, we had somebody relapse because they were tired of going to their legal drug dealer and the hassle of it, ended up going back to the street drug. They also will max out the dosage and take half of it themselves and then sell the rest of it. You also find people with prescriptions being opportunistic, and they only use a certain portion of it and they sell the rest of it. So the prescriptions, the amount of prescriptions in the community indicate the number of available drugs in the community as well. So I think we've had a really good improvement over the past couple of years. We've seen both from the insurers and from the providers at cutting down the number of the amount, the dosage that are being prescribed, as well as the quantity that is being prescribed. So I think everybody recognizes those issues, and it's really, I mean, we see it because, you know, we have people that end up, you know, slicing their leg with a chainsaw over the weekend. We have a lot of adventurous employees. Slice their leg with a chainsaw over the weekend, go to the ER. We see a lot less opioid prescriptions from those types of situations. A lot more over-the-counter medications, and a lot of alternatives that don't include opioids. So that's been, I think, a win for the community.
Name is Jacob. My question is for Mr. Kelly. It's something that you said at the beginning of this discussion that I don't technically agree with. You said that taxing opioids would incentivize addicts to consume less. I see the incentive you speak of somewhat. However, what about those who are not addicted and are in the worst possible state possible and are actually in need of these drugs, but the costs are found to be a hardship for them? What about their voices? Obviously, the opioid epidemic is imperative to pay attention to. That's why we're here. My question ties in Obamacare and the Affordable Health Care Act. Will their voices be heard? That's my question.
But before you get with my great, tell me again, your concern is with patients that...
You said that taxing opioids would incentivize addicts to consume less.
I'm sorry, I said taxing?
Yes, you said tax revenue of drugs.
I don't remember saying that.
What do you say?
Well, what, you seem to think I did, but is there anybody else in the audience here we talk about taxing opioids? I don't know, believe that we mentioned it.
You said general tax revenues.
Yeah, can you be more specific?
The allocation of those revenues.
You talk about the allocation of government funds.
You said tax.
Well, I don't want to get back and forth about what you think I said or what I did say. Your question is how would these folks, how would they get prescriptions? Is that what you're asking me, or what are you asking me directly?
What about people who need these drugs and aren't addicted?
Well, I don't think there's a question about people who need those drugs. If they need them, they could be prescribed by a doctor. I think my question is, there are other ways to treat pain without having addictive drugs. So I think that's the key. Some of these are such great strength in prescribing such great number that it goes beyond, I think, what people need. I know when I had my shoulder operated on, one of the things the doctors told me is make sure you keep taking these pills and stay ahead of the pain. Well, I got to the point, I said, you know what, I think that it's time for me just to go ahead and put up with the pain and not try to stay ahead of it. Now, in my case, I was able to walk away from it, but people have different thresholds of pain. Some people say, you know what, I kind of like that feeling, and I think I'll continue down that road. So I don't know that you can make a general statement about this person or this prescription would take care of society in general. I'm just saying you have to be very careful because each of us has different tolerances.
Yes, I totally agree that there are better routes to go about rather than just drugs. Can you elaborate on such opportunities?
No, I'm not sure I understand your question. You're asking about revenue. What part of revenue?
I'm not talking about revenue. I'm talking about these opportunities rather than drugs. You yourself say that you were ahead of the game and that you stopped because you had the self-control. What about people who don't have self-control? What are their ways? I heard someone else on the panel.
I think they should go to whatever it is that is giving them their treatment and telling them, this has gone way beyond the point of this is tolerable for me. I need help. A lot of people seek that out, and some people don't because they think they can handle it themselves. So I would think that for all of us, if you have a medical condition or you have something that's concerning you, I would go to somebody who's actually schooled that way and get them to help me get through that period.
Hi, thanks so much for your participation in this panel. I'm Shannon Madiachi from the Political Science Department here. I'm really struck by how all of the panelists are talking very much the language of rehabilitation, the language of of help and support. And when we look at the history of U.S. drug policy and even the history of U.S. drug discourse among our public, it's not been a discourse in general that has been focused on support and care for the addict. It's really quite overwhelming that there's been a strong focus in our country on retributive and very harsh measures, and yet there's a real shift, I think, in our country recently. Maybe the panel is an example of that, and I'm wondering your thoughts on why you think the language has shifted so much. Why, from, say, the 1980s crack epidemic, right? What's different today? It's beautiful to hear the language, and I'm wondering to what you attribute that shift.
Can I take it? Well, I think that the sheer numbers of people that are affected, I think it makes it hard to ignore. And so that when we hear of the number of people that die every day, you know, that is so high in number compared to anything that we've seen in the past, I think has been eye-opening. But I think the other thing is that, you know, there is the stigma. And I think that for many years we said that, you know, people who are drug addicts are morally bankrupt for whatever reason and not really worth considering. You know, the comments of, you know, don't revive them because, you know, they will die anyway. That was sort of the feeling for a lot of people, and that's how that whole group of people, those addicts, were thought of as something wrong with you. Now that there's so many people, and now that there's so many people that we know, that they're young people, that they're educated people, that they're people that, you know, that it's hard for you to look at them and say that they're morally bankrupt. Now I think that, you know, the different people that are affected, as well as the number of people, it just makes it impossible to ignore.
Thank you, panel, for the good comments. I'm Cole Stearns from Erie, and although I think a lot of this dialogue's been very helpful, it troubles me that so much of it is dealing with after the fact, once these opioids are widely distributed and widely prescribed. So, just briefly, it's clear to me in the course of raising a family in northwestern PA that just through normal medical procedures, opioids have been the drug of first choice to deal with pain. For Mr. Kelly talked about having surgery to his shoulder. I had arthroscopic surgery to my shoulder a couple of years ago. And I was prescribed OxyContin as absolutely the drug of first choice, not last choice. And never, when any of our family members have been given these drugs, have we received any warning that I'm getting a drug that if I am physically so inclined, one pill could lead me to addiction. Not just a string of taking it over time, but if I happen to have addictive physical tendencies, taking one of these pills could put me in a terrible situation. And so I'm wondering how the medical community has for a long time understood the addictive qualities of these medications. But yet only now are they rising up and saying, boy, this is really a problem. And as I say, I look at just the normal course of our family medical history. It came clear to my wife and I a couple of years ago that we had accumulated a large stash of opioids in our house, really through no effort of our own other than having them doled out to us in a preventive way. And Mr. Kelly, your comment about aspirin as the prior avenue of choice is a good one, but clearly aspirin is not a money generator in today's medical industrial complex. And so now we've got these highly profitable drugs and a system where they become the drug of first choice with very little warning and very little understanding. And now the whole discussion today is largely focused on, now what do we do? Now the horse is out of the barn.
I'm just going to say something real quick to you, because I think what you said is so clear. We don't know when these drugs are prescribed to us what their effect is. I'm going to give you a personal example. My sister was dying of pancreatic cancer. The doctor had prescribed Oxycontin for her. Well, she got to a point where she was having a tough time swallowing, and so I'm thinking, you know what? The problem is that she can't get this pill down, so I bought a stylus in a bowl, and I would take that Oxycontin and grind it up, and I would mix it with pudding to give her, because I thought, I know she can handle the pudding or the applesauce, she can't swallow the pill. And what I didn't realize, she would go through these incredible explosions, and she would just go out of control. And her doctor came up to see her at the house, and I said, "Doc, where I'm talking to?" I said, "Listen, there's something wrong with Joyce's medicine. It's causing her to really go off the rails." And he said, "No, it shouldn't be any problem. I mean, what I've prescribed her is going to really help with her pain." I said, "Well, she was having trouble swallowing it, so I would use it in the stylus. I'd pound it down and I'd put it with the applesauce." He goes, "Oh my God, you can't do that. That's like setting off a firework inside her brain. That's a time release." And so I said, "Well, you never told us that. You never told us that." And our idea was, again, right, because you see it every day, the idea is, how do you take people from and all this pain and make it easier for them? And I agree with you. There's no directions on the bottle. It just says, take these when you're feeling pain. And then it becomes a habit, and even once you're over all that, a lot of seniors are addicted because they've gone through that same process. So I know exactly what you're talking about, and I know the aspirin doesn't work for everything. I'm just saying, at the time I was growing up, they didn't have these other products, thank God. But it is, not knowing what you don't know can be a real problem. So I understand what you're talking about. Had that doctor told us earlier about that, I never would have done that. I thought I was helping her. And I wasn't. I was really, it was driving her way beyond the point of anything she could actually handle.
Well, I think that things are certainly changing now. I don't believe that there was the widespread real knowledge of the pain medication and the extent of addiction from short courses of medication. Again, I think that for the most part, physicians were focused on, making sure my patient felt well and that, relieve pain as much as possible. And I don't think that people were really carefully thinking about how much medication a patient really needed to get over the acute amount or the acute event, and what would happen with those leftover pills. So I think that there was certainly a deficit of knowledge and just not the caution in terms of prescribing those medications. We are doing a lot better now as a profession to really educate our members on really the long-term effects of those medications. There are a lot of external restrictions then are being put on physicians. There are health insurers now that will only allow a certain number of days of medication for any patients with narcotics. Again, there's the drug monitoring program so that we can see what people are being prescribed, and required education for physicians. So yes, there should have been a wider awareness of the effects of these large quantities of prescriptions. There certainly wasn't, but there's definitely a lot more attention to it now, and we're moving forward. I think, as Ms. Smith said, we are seeing the prescriptions decrease. The number of prescriptions are significantly decreasing. Physicians are having those conversations about appropriate use of medications and the risks for addiction. So we're certainly having a lot more of that. But yes, it's a little bit late coming on, but we're making those changes now.
So I just want to say thanks for the discussion today, but it seems to me that potentially a component is being missed, and that's the big pharmaceutical industry. So my question for all of you is, what can be done? We just said that there wasn't anything warning, they were just not doing the labels properly. Is there anything that this industry should be required to do to prevent this crisis from continuing?
So, yeah, I'll try to start on that, but kind of almost segueing from the previous question, which I think was clearly related. I think one danger is that we might kind of overcorrect for what's happened. So I think one thing we don't want to do is have just this kind of uniform pill limit. I think what we really want is physician discretion. I think we want physician education, and then I think it's up to the physician, kind of another earlier question of, when someone's in the situation, I think it should be, between the patient and the physician to figure out what's the best course to go forward. And so I think one thing that can happen is if we have a uniform pill limit, then someone that might be addicted, they might then go to heroin. And now heroin has fentanyl in it has carfentanil, it has these things that are, way more dangerous in terms of overdose death than the prescription drugs, medication. So, I think, there's a lawsuit right now. I think the issue is we're all going to have to kind of figure out the solution to this, like collectively as a country, and we're going to have to all come together. And I think the pharmaceutical companies are going to have a role in that. I think, I don't know exactly what some of them have done, but my impression is that some of them, have already made kind of good faith efforts. One thing I'll say, so another example, kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, there's really clear evidence that OxyContin, there was a reformulation of OxyContin so that this precise thing couldn't happen as easily. So you couldn't just kind of mash it up and take stuff out. So it got turned into this kind of time release, I think it was a gummy or something to that effect. And then what happened as a result of that is people started going to heroin. And that actually, there's very clear empirical evidence that it looks like kind of the reformulation of OxyContin is what led to the uptick in heroin deaths. And then, the heroin with fentanyl. So, I think where we are now, I think it's a matter of figuring out the best way forward, and I think everyone's voice is going to have to be at the table, and I think it will include those pharmaceutical companies.
Also, and I think you're right, but again, for people who smoke, there's actually a declaration on the pack of cigarettes about what this could cause, and even having that declaration on it, people say, well, you know what, I like to smoke anyways. And if you watch on TV, when people have an advertisement for some type of a medication, usually in a 1 minute ad, there's like 15 seconds that addresses what it's designed for, and then there's like 45 seconds talking about the side effects that could happen, and usually the last thing is it could cause death. And I said to my wife oftentimes, well, I don't know why they're developing this if at the end of it, depending on who you are and what your situation is, it could actually be deadly. So there is a declaration, but I think probably more important than anything else is that not the over-the-counter drugs, but the drugs that are, the medications that are prescribed by a doctor should be able to sit down and should be able to actually walk you through that whole process to tell you the upside and the downside of whatever the medication is. And say, more than anything else, you're going to have to keep a close eye on this to see how it affects you. I don't know that there's a one-size-fits-all. I wish there was, but there is not. I think government can have oversight of it, but at certain points, people are going to, it's human nature, they're going to do certain things that are even knowing it's harmful, they'll still do it. So I think education is probably the best part in understanding what it is that you're taking.
I think we have time for this.
Right here in the first row. Oh, I'm sorry, wait, I don't want to take it. I took the mic out of his hands. You want
Okay, so my question is, to what extent, if any, do you guys think that the drug war has increased the prevalence of synthetic drugs like fentanyl and things like that are more likely to lead to overdose deaths than just prescription opioids?
So again was to what extent the I guess the war on drugs has affected the synthetics.
Yeah, well, like just like illicit, like just I guess the illicit drug market in general, and like dangerous drugs like fentanyl, because oftentimes people aren't sure like if the heroin they're buying has fentanyl in it and things like that. So just like the black market created, if that plays a part in the opioid crisis in general and the large number of overdose deaths.
So I think in a couple of ways. The first that I mentioned before is that if you are addicted to prescription drugs, it becomes really expensive very quickly, and you need to move on to something else to keep from having that withdrawal. And so that may be heroin, and heroin is going to be mixed with other things. Also mentioned is the reformulation of those prescription medications. Anything that makes the prescriptions less available will lead to more withdrawal. Now, if that withdrawal then precipitates recovery, then that's fine. But then often that withdrawal then leads people to things that will be illicit, and so those can be mixed with other things. I think in terms of manufacturing of illegal drugs, I think there certainly is a market now for synthetics that are not regulated, right? Because there's not anything that, this formulation that you can make that can have the same sort of effect isn't quite known yet, and so it's not well regulated. And so, there certainly is an opening for those sort of medications or drugs to be available now as well. So yes, we're seeing a lot more of those tainted heroin drugs because of less availability than of the others.
All right, well.
Can I mention one more thing? Can I mention just one thing? We do in Crawford County have a website that's called letstalkhelps.org or .com, and we have information about resources that are available throughout the community, how you can find help, how you can get to a support group, all kinds of information like that. So that is something that we'd like to widely promote as a good resource for people and families who are looking for help.
And Meadville Medical Center hosted an event recently for employers, and I understand there's going to be another event as well. So I would recommend that anybody who's available to attend that Let's Talk event.
May 1st at Active Aging.
All right, so thank you to the panelists. Thank you everyone for